So I'm Jeff Staton. It's nice to meet everybody. The basic research that my group has been conducting deals with the claim that's at the top of the screen here. The claim is that independent courts, judiciaries exercising some kind of review authority over governments are critical components of stabilizing democracies, in large part by helping leaders make commitments that are credible to a variety of limits on their authority. And there's empirical evidence for that. The question is, there are also facts that are somewhat unsettling. In many countries, it turns out, that judges are commonly purged from their posts. In 2007, the Constitutional Tribunal of Bolivia was rendered incorrect through a series of politically motivated attacks and resignations. Judges are also commonly verbally critiqued and intimidated. And importantly, not all judicial decisions, not all direct orders commanding government officials to do this or that are complied with. I think it's important to stress that this last piece is not just a feature of regimes that we think of as relatively unstable, but we have evidence from many stable democracies of forms of non-compliance of one another. In Europe, here in Germany, the United States, in Costa Rica, most recently in the last 12 years of experience in Israel. So the question is, how could it be true that independent courts could be stabilizing regimes? The way that we understand what courts are doing is that if they're subject to threats and they might be ignored. So our sense is what they do is they provide a mechanism by which leaders and people that they govern can resolve institutionally potential disagreements over particular actions that may violate constitutional limits, for example, or legal limits on their authority. For judges to do that effectively, they have to be incentivized to give independent judgment, we believe. That is, there will be misunderstandings about limits over authority. For judges to impact the way that we resolve those disagreements, they actually have to give judgment that's independent, and they have to have incentives to do so. And the second thing is we think they have to accept that on occasion, some of their decisions will be ignored. And that's, from a rule of law perspective, something that I think we need to be clear about, that though there are reasons to be concerned about forms of noncompliance, there is a motivation to avoid it at all costs undermines independent judging, okay? So empirically what we thought we ought to see is that attacks on judges, and we'll measure that with an index of politically motivated purging and public critiques of decision-making, ought to be associated with regime instability, in part because that kind of context undermines independent judgment, but that noncompliance as such was not necessarily a problem for democratic regimes. So the empirical analysis that we do is going to be a statistical analysis of regime survival, all democracies from 1900 to 2001, where the goal here is to estimate the probability of democratic regime collapse given measures of judicial attacks and noncompliance that we had from the V-Dem project. So just to give you a sense of, just a screenshot of the data, kind of what this looks like. This is just a plot of breakdowns on the scale of attacks, where this is bad on the right, on the left is good. The 60 points on top are the 60 breakdowns of democracy that happened during that period, and that's just a smooth line suggesting that this probability of breakdown is kind of higher on the right side of the graph than the left. Okay, so what did we find? Just to give you a sense of the substantive implications here, so about a 1 standard deviation change in this V-Dem index is associated with a 59% increase in the chance of regime collapse. That's about a 57-year loss in the expected long-run survival of a democracy. And to put that in context with like a couple of country comparisons, that would be like looking at the difference between Costa Rica in the 1960s in Guatemala. The second thing is that the non-compliance effect we estimate to be pretty close to zero and massively uncertain. So the implication here is not necessarily that non-compliance is necessarily in all cases a good thing, but there are reasons why we might not want to avoid it in all costs. And so in terms of the implications, a couple things, and I would organize them around two sort of general trade-offs in legal scholarship. And the first is with respect to the sort of trade-off between judicial independence and accountability. So if you're concerned about a tax, you might think that what you want to do is ensure it's hard to remove judges from the bench, and that runs into an accountability trade-off. That's a standard kind of concern. But it's important to recognize that when thinking about that, we're also thinking about not just are judges running politics, or are they accountable to leaders, but they have regime effects as well. So what do you do in terms of policy? I put a question mark next to high bars for removal, and the reason the question mark is there is because I think it's genuinely a live, very much open question as to how to institutionally design a system to produce judges who are incentivized to give independent judgment. It's a live research project here in V-Dem, and I just don't know that we know the answer to that yet. The second trade-off has to do with the rule of law, and the trade-off between constraining leaders and providing a little bit of flexibility in the system. I think there's a growing sense in my team that some degree of non-compliance can be part of a healthy regime. And so what I'm increasingly drawn to are conversations with judges about the notion of engaging in a kind of dialogue between judges and leaders about the nature of limits. So rather than imagine a role for a judge as giving an answer and walking to the next case, in some contexts it's going to be very helpful to give an answer that allows for a little bit of flexibility to reconsider the potential that when leaders say they can't comply with an order, it's potentially good reasons. So thank you very much.